My name is Tom Hassenboehler. Thank you, Julia, for inviting us. I am the Chief Counsel for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I work for Chairman Greg Walden, who is the new chairman, newly appointed chairman as of 2017 from Oregon. He's former head of the National Republican Congressional Committee, and he has taken on the tall order of becoming chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which our committee does quite a broad variety of jurisdictions for the Congress. We have everything from all energy environment matters, public health, commerce issues, oversight of things, telecommunications. So it's a new beginning for the committee, and I've been with the committee for several years, but I'm in a new role now working for him. I'll stop and let Rick introduce himself before I get too far ahead.
And I'm Rick, despite the similarity in appearance. We're not the same person. I'm Rick Kessler. I'm the subcommittee staff director for the Energy and Environment subcommittees for the Democrats. So kind of the mirror image. And I work for ranking member Frank Pallone from New Jersey, who I've known personally for some 25, 30 years now. It's hard for me to remember. This is my second tour of duty on the committee. I worked for former Chairman John Dingell on the committee, as well as being his chief of staff. I worked for Mr. Pallone years ago as well as a governor and a few other members of Congress. So I just came back to the committee about 3 years ago now, and it's been a pleasure working with our members. You met at least one of my two subcommittee ranking members this morning, Paul Tonko, who's ranking member on the Environment Subcommittee. My other ranking member is Bobby Rush from Illinois, who I've known for many, many years as well. I guess that's probably enough for us, or for me for now. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I guess why are we here and why do you care, I guess, is the first question. And so we are here to kind of give you a perspective from Congress that you probably don't hear very often, is that yes, we do things that don't get reported, and yes, we do get along, and yes, we actually have some successes to talk about, even though that may not get reported as well right now. And so I think on a bipartisan basis, we're here to talk about giving you maybe a sense of optimism for Congress and what happens in Washington. I understand probably a lot of you are from outside of the Beltway. We do a lot of these kinds of panel discussions with the insiders, or you want to call it inside the Beltway folks that do these jobs on a daily basis. But what we don't get to do is really get out into the country enough and see what's actually happening out in the power sector and in our areas of expertise, which for this particular summit I think is very timely and beneficial to have you guys being here at this unique time and so much change and disruption in the electricity space. And believe it or not, Congress is not completely asleep at the switch on this, and I can explain a little more about why I feel that way and why I think we're heading in a direction that you may be intrigued by. The first thing I thought I would start off with, and then let kind of Rick respond to, is do energy issues matter in Congress in 2017 at all? I think they're certainly not on the front burner on either political side of our spectrum. These have not made a difference in the elections or in any of the major headlines recently, I would say, short of maybe the Paris Climate Agreement discussion that when Trump withdrew, that got a lot of headlines, obviously, for various reasons. But beyond that, I haven't seen too many national headlines on energy.
Yeah, I think they matter, though not in the way they did, say, when we did EPAC 05, which we both worked on at different times. It's the groundswell. There are no high prices that are driving consumers at the pumps or at wholesale and electricity. Prices are at least objectively down from where they were 10 years ago. So we're not facing the kind of atmosphere we were when we enacted EPAC 05 or even EPAC 92 or the 07 Act. So in a sense, I agree with that, yeah. But what we have talked about, at least on the sidelines, is infrastructure, and that's been the
one of the buzzwords of this Congress, how are we going to be able to do a large infrastructure plan? Can that be bipartisan? What does that mean? How is it defined? And of course, that's all in the eye of the beholder of how we define it here in Congress. And it gets into some of the party divides about the role of the federal government versus the states. And what our committee has done so far this year is take a look at infrastructure broadly, energy infrastructure, and we've tried to look at it in as much of a nonpartisan lens as possible. We've looked at grid security, grid innovation, we've looked at pipelines and infrastructure, domestic issues, we've looked at cybersecurity, resiliency issues, all the things that are currently sort of bubbling around the edges in all of the states, but there's not one nationalized idea or consensus around how to address these issues. And yes, climate is part of that discussion. It's more of an underlying piece of the discussion. How do we make our infrastructure more resilient to 21st century threats, whether that be coming from cyber attacks or coming from severe weather or coming from geomagnetic storms or things that, EMP threats that we've heard, some of them are overinflated, some of them are not. We hear all these things coming up to Congress, but there's no consensus on how to deal with it. So we've tried our best to build a hearing record that surveys the scope and then tries to find some solutions that our committee, which has a distinct jurisdiction over a lot of these issues, can begin to address in a bipartisan way. Some of them have been more bipartisan than others, and I'll just kind of go through a list of things that we've actually done so far this year, and then maybe have Rick react to those too. But and not all of these are in the electricity space, but we certainly have looked at things that impact electricity. Hydro licensing reform is a big issue before Congress right now. There's a lot of it's clean, it's renewable, but yet how do we preserve the integrity of the current dams and the issues that we're looking at with some of the impacts on the licensing, on species, and on some of the tribal considerations. We've addressed brownfields reauthorization, which is an infrastructure plan. It's how do we help repurpose land that's been out there, that's blighted, that the federal government can actually provide some solutions to the states. We're looking at tomorrow actually reauthorizing the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a major infrastructure initiative. How does the federal government provide funding to states and local communities to help meet compliance with the drinking water regulations for the country that all states and localities have to deal with? We're trying to address comprehensive nuclear waste policy management. We passed on a very strong bipartisan vote, a bipartisan plan to address interim storage combined with looking at how to repurpose Yucca Mountain basically in a new way that's part of the 21st century approach to these things. We're looking at reauthorizing things like the State Energy Program, which is a DOE functioning program and giving it more cyber authority so they can be more resilient and more in touch with current threats. We're looking at things on gas pipelining and permitting processes. We're looking at things like cross-border energy infrastructure. How do we bring in new transmission lines and pipelines with our neighbors in Canada and Mexico? How do we look at trade issues? I mean, all these are bills and things that we've done so far this Congress, or we're in the process of doing, and a lot of them have been completely bipartisan. So in a way, as Rick takes that down, then I'll turn it over to you to maybe react to our approach on how we've handled a lot of these issues this year, and our hope that we can actually make these into a larger comprehensive infrastructure plan with some of the other committees in Congress to actually get a win for the nation this year as we build all this record.
I think apart from climate, infrastructure is probably the thing most on my members' minds, and Mr. Pallone, along with the Democratic members of the committee, introduced a bill called the Lift America Act, which attempted to be our statement on the things we thought could and should be done in the way of enhancing infrastructure within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee. So there's an energy component for us, there are environmental components, but there's also things like healthcare, hospital construction, things like that. And I think Mr. Pallone in particular sees it as a place where we could all work together. I think one of the more prominent energy aspects of our proposal deals with grants for upgrading the grid, modernization, smart grids, things like that. And that's something that comes out of the previous administration, out of Secretary Moniz and out of the Quadrennial Energy Review. It was one of the recommendations, and it's something that Ranking Member Pallone's very passionate about, and I think it's something an area we see. We can't always agree on money, but I think the goals of that are something we agree on. And most of what Tom talked about, with the exception of the cross-border and pipeline expediting bills, are things we agreed on and did together. I think one of the things, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of you here, that may be of more interest to this crowd and more relevant than what we passed, because it's not just what we passed, it's the things we don't necessarily act on right away that are of interest, and that's electricity, because one of the best things we can do as a congressional committee is do no harm. And we've been doing a series of bipartisan hearings that started during the last Congress and have continued over the last couple of weeks. We just had one this morning. You guys made Ranking Member Tonko late to that one, but I'll forgive you. No, he really enjoyed this morning, he said. But we had a hearing that involved all the regional transmission organizations this morning, and it was an extremely well-attended hearing. And it was one of these things that you probably don't hear about on the outside, because it was a very nonpartisan hearing. In fact, these series of hearings we have done together. There was no majority memo, minority memo. There were no majority witnesses, minority witnesses. We developed these hearings together. And in some ways, some of this even comes out of our first exposure to, from Julia to the 51st state. It was one of the things that kind of got us talking and thinking about these things. And these are educational hearings designed to give our members a kind of non-biased, very substantive fact-based look into these issues, so that they can make informed decisions. It may be that we go our separate way, our members go their separate ways. I would likely think it almost inevitably breaks down regionally later on, but it doesn't matter as long as the members understand what they're doing and make the best informed decisions they can. And that's kind of our goal in these hearings, is to do no harm and to educate and to try and make ourselves smart, so that we decide to make policy where necessary and stay away from it where we don't think we can improve things.
And I'll go a bit bigger than that. I think, when we sat down to talk about, we're calling this the Powering America series. And what's different is that, over the last decade, really, Congress has kind of ebbed and flowed on energy policy. We haven't, we did big energy bills in 2005 and 2007. And then after that, the rage was, how do we address climate change and cap and trade? And all of the energy issues kind of got hijacked into this large umbrella of climate change and finding a national solution to climate. Obviously, that didn't pass the Congress, and it suffered various iterations over a couple of years. But since that point, then under the last president, we had sort of a regulatory approach through the Environmental Protection Agency that really sidelined a lot of bipartisanship on energy issues, because it was, it was trying to accomplish through the regulatory process what couldn't be accomplished through the legislative process. And that's how a lot of our members viewed this issue, which it wasn't because they didn't want to address some of these issues on climate, or it wasn't because they didn't agree with the policy per se. It was more because of the tactics that were being done. And now we sort of learned, we've had an ability to absorb a lot of this information over the last 10 years. And what you're seeing now is the states and consumers and markets changing to help better appreciate and value things that consumers want. And that's to a lot of credit to what you guys are doing out there, trying to bring about change in the electricity system, to modernize, to innovate, to bring less emissions, to have consumers be more of an active participant in the electricity system that they weren't able to do with technology less than 5 years ago even. And the data and the digital combination of all of these issues really helps to, I think, break down some of the partisan barriers that have been evident in this space. And I think what you're going to see in our Powering America series is a recognition of that from both sides, is that these issues shouldn't be partisan. They should be about driving change and progress forward, and being able to help activate consumers to make more decisions on their own. How do they save money? How do they figure out ways to, value their preferences in the system? Whether that's through, going off the grid or figuring out ways to have, storage or data solutions that can save them money or allow them to generate power from their own resources. And that's, to me, not a partisan thing, and that's not a partisan thing to our new chairman, Chairman Greg Walden, who, was in charge of the telecom and the communication side of the committee for several years and is very open to a lot of these changes that are happening. He brings about sort of a new perspective. We also have Subcommittee Chairman Fred Upton, who wants to address a lot of these issues in a way. So then the question is, that's first kind of breaking down the ice and breaking the barriers. The second part and the much more difficult part is, okay, well, what is the solution and how do we actually help to bring about change that a lot of you guys are working on? And that's where I think these hearings are really going to help bring about a lot of fact-based discussions, the blurring lines of jurisdiction, the changes in how we look at electricity generation, transmission, distribution across the sectors. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but there is a lot of uncertainty evolving, and something we heard out of the RTOs and ISOs today is there's a lot of things that are changing before them too, and that you guys are dealing with at the local, at the state level, and at the Public Utility Commission level, which I understand they're following us. So, but these issues are all starting to bubble up to Congress, and there's not, while there may not be a one-size-fits-all approach, is there a better way to have more of a common currency type of approach where we're not so fragmented and balkanized in all of these types of regional differences, because it does, to me, help have an impact on some of the innovations that are happening out in the sector if you don't have the same kind of rules of the road across the board. So those are things that we'll be exploring, and I think it could lead to some very interesting ideas over the next several Congresses.
Yeah, in a sense, it's Congress at its best, because we're getting out ahead of these changes without being reactive, as we often are. And so, and trying to educate, our members are trying to educate themselves and understand where things are going, what y'all are doing, what technology is driving, as Tom said, rather than us making those choices in an uninformed manner or even inserting Congress at this point. I think the idea of the blurred state lines, as Tom said, between federal and state is really something that our members are really focused on trying to absorb without necessarily yet inserting themselves. But if you would listen to this hearing this morning, you saw some stirrings of why Congress might, where some of the policies being driven more by the regional transmission organizations rather than by the states or by Congress, there might be a point at which the members say, that's enough, it's time for us to step in and set a national policy or redraw these lines, or they may just say, we've looked at this and it's not time for us to get in. So it's a very, like I said, it's kind of the committee and Congress at its best.
Yeah, and just, I guess, in sort of closing, but I was looking at the blueprint that the 51st state had done, and, Rick and I were talking about these types of key doctrines that they put out, promote, of points of consensus, promote efficiencies, clearly define roles, identify principles, and foster customer choice. Those are things that I think no one would disagree with on our side. Of course, the devil's in the details on how we do those things. But again, what is, without facts and by Congress kind of proactively starting to get into this space, and we're talking about a deliberative set of hearings that will bring in a lot of the different stakeholders, and if you have interest in looking at how to participate in these, we'd encourage you to talk to us.
Absolutely.
Because we want to be able to explain to the members the changes that they're seeing in their districts. And it's not just in New York State or California, it really is across the country right now. And while we recognize the, what the states provide and what each district provides in their unique perspective on how they want to power themselves, I do think that because technology is changing so fast, it's our responsibility now to take on these issues and to really get out front of it. And so that's where I think you won't see that in the headlines. You won't see that in the discussion about, are we going to talk about climate change this year? Are we going to talk about, what is Congress going to do on energy? Yes, we'll do some energy things. We have the infrastructure packages of things we're doing. But this next wave of ideas, I think, is where you may see some gelling that you haven't seen in a long time. because of the changes that are happening out there, and they're driven by the customers and the consumers, really.
So again, if people have questions come up, I have a couple questions that I'm going to ask that I've thought of as I've listened to them, but please feel free to come to the mics. So one of you mentioned the QER.
Yeah.
So with the change of administration, is the QER, or the recommendations, how strongly are those going to be considered, or is the QER something that's going to go on the shelf until some point in the future?
Well, speaking for my members, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think our members found the first QER in particular very useful. It had been a long time since the department or any administration, probably since the first Bush administration, I should say. Although I guess there's the second Bush energy plan. But really, it had been a long time since we saw that kind of a thoughtful look at anything related to energy from the federal government from that level. So I think it's still very relevant for my members. The second one is also interesting. We think the process of going through this kind of review is worthwhile, and I know Ranking Member Rush, actually, he hasn't introduced it, but has legislation he's been considering to require that. And, I know there's similar legislation on the Senate side, I think Senator Coons. So I think those are the types of things. The short answer is yes, we find it valuable, and no, they won't sit on the shelf.
Yeah. Tom, you agree?
There was some value in the QER, and I think there is some value in thinking about how to do it going forward. I don't know if we agree completely that they're necessary for at the rate and the sort of the comprehensive nature of how they were looking at doing them. Is just a question that I think this administration is trying to figure out about how to look at it. But I do think there are some areas that we can look at on the role of them. But again, I would say our hearing record is going to start to build a very current look at that, and then we'll see the value of it going forward. I mean, I think the jury's out on our side whether it's still valuable for going forward to continue to do them. So.
Okay. Please introduce yourself. And
yes,
then
Commissioner Harold Gray from Delaware. I heard you talk about energy, and I heard you talk about infrastructure. I didn't hear you say anything about a wall contemplated with solar panels down in the Southwest. And as money matters start in the House, what can you tell this audience about that idea?
I would defer all those questions to the appropriators and the other committees of jurisdiction. So.
And actually, we're still arguing whether the wall should have solar panels or whether it has nuclear waste buried under it. So
right.
Until we resolve that.
Great way to debate.
Those things, the nuclear waste thing was actually proposed. So
yeah, that was
strange times.
Okay, well, I do have one more question. Oh, actually, go ahead, please.
Not sure this is great. Roger Zweed with a company called Doosan Grid Tech out in Seattle. I'm wondering how the House committee views the federal government's role in R&D in this space, and ARPA-E and some of those programs that look like they're in trouble now under the Trump administration.
Yep. I think our side definitely values R&D budgets and innovation. I think there's a difference. I mean, the reason why you didn't hear us talk about it too much is our committee actually doesn't do the R&D side of things. That's a separate committee in the House, even though there is, I would say, bipartisan support on a lot of it, even though to the extent I think the debate goes is how much goes into the basic research side versus the applied research and deployment of some of these technologies. That's where you see the parties start to differ. But I know the Science Committee in the House is actively looking at reauthorizing a lot of these programs, so I wouldn't necessarily read everything that you see in the budget as part of that discussion, but there's as a final product. And in fact, there's an energy and water bill on the floor today that's looking at a lot of funding issues, and that's currently not in the proposed budget. So depending on how that shakes out in the House, you'll start to see how our members view and value those things, and you'll get a better sense of it. So I would say it's not a consensus around the budget.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, we never say we don't have jurisdiction over something in our committee, but ARPA, I mean, there's a lot of support for ARPA-E in particular, and I think on our side of the aisle, the initial budget, whether the FY17 or 18 budgets, really weren't taken seriously. I mean, they were very political documents with no sense of reality. These programs I mean, ARPA-E came to be under, I think, under Obama, but you know, the research programs have maintained the support of both administrations from both sides of the aisle, both Bushes, President Clinton, President Obama, just to go back, you know, the last 4. So, you know, I think ultimately there'll be consensus. These cuts are short-sighted because the benefits yielded by this research go way beyond just energy. And I think most members on both sides of the aisle understand this.
Great. So my final question, I just want to go back to the infrastructure conversation for a minute, because I'm thinking back last year, some of the inside the Beltway conversations that I heard a lot of people saying, no matter who wins the election, infrastructure is going to be a big deal. But as the energy industry, particularly as the electric power sector, we really need to have a loud voice to make sure that the grid is part of that infrastructure conversation. And obviously, both of you, feel strongly that that's true as well. But how confident should this industry be that if we see a comprehensive plan on infrastructure going forward, that the grid is going to be an integral part of that? Is that, yes, that's certainly going to happen, or you're going to try, but who knows?
I mean, it's a tough question just because, it goes back to what we're looking at with the hearing series. I mean, a lot of these, there is not one federal solution to how to fund or modernize or innovate the grid. I mean, you've got, a lot of state rate-making decisions going into that. You've got a lot of local decisions going into that. There is certainly a research function. There's a cybersecurity function. There's a resiliency function that I think we can talk about. So we're looking at sort of the nibbling around the edges on that, but I don't have a strong sense of how, we can solve one big sweeping vision of how to modernize the grid in a piece of legislation.
Well, I'm going to say, and this is no secret to you, in the infrastructure is a huge priority for Ranking Member Pallone. The grid grants that we've proposed have for 2 years been one of our top 2 priorities. So for him, absent action on that, I think would really call into question the usefulness of an energy piece of an infrastructure bill.
Great.
So.
All right. Well, please join me in that. By the way, I have to say, in the sock competition, I think Rick has maybe taken the lead in terms of loudest socks.
We got Ike and Mike.
Ike and Mike
Candy.
Candies. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to come over here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.